possible, I've gotten the only picture of Eric Clapton playing Layla. And that would be really cool, right? So what do we have here? We have a moral hazard problem. We have a moral hazard problem. I'm not exactly sure what happens in policing the no cell phone rule, but I do know that there are a lot of YouTube videos of Eric on the internet. Somebody was breaking the rules. This is just macroeconomics. It's a very different discipline than micro. Very different discipline than micro. So that's the first principle that I want to leave you with this morning, is when you're talking about economics, particularly when you're talking to people who you might want to influence, such as policymakers who have come up through the electoral process, who aren't necessarily trained as we are, is don't simply say, let's discuss the economics of a situation. Because economics is not a homogeneous concept. It's not a homogeneous discipline. Be very clear. Be very clear whether or not you're talking about microeconomics or macroeconomics. And it's not just for the sake of good articulation, it's for the sake of results. Because normal human beings don't think macro. They simply don't. They think, I stand up, I get a better view. And politicians, no disrespect to the field whatsoever, I have friends who are politicians. I know politicians I would buy a used car from, and that's a very strong statement of trust and faith. So I'm not suggesting that they're not robustly moral people. However, they rationally want to get elected. And to get elected, they need to preach, campaign, evangelize to voters who don't understand macro. So they have to put public policy, frame public policy into a context where they think the voter who they want to vote for me will understand. It's why when you think in terms of what's going on with austerity, which is the bane of our global macro existence right now, it stems from a fundamental ignorance problem. A politician will appeal to a voter with micro, not macro. He will say to a voter, if you have your hours cut back at work, or God forbid, lose your job, it is rational for you to go home and say to your wife and family, and be honest about it, my paycheck's going down. Therefore, we must tighten up our budget. Your family will appreciate your honesty. They will empathize for your position as the dominant provider to the home. You'll have a community in your kitchen where everyone will be understanding, and you will rationally sit down and figure out where you can tighten up the budget to reflect that your paycheck's going down because we're living in hard economic times. That's the preamble of the speech. And then the politician will get the nod from the voter and then say, and would you not agree that we in government should do the same thing? The voter, who may be the plumber, or the mechanic who works on your car, yes, sir, I'll vote for you. I understand. We do that in my household. We want you to do that in Washington or Berlin or Brasilia or wherever the case may be. And they get elected. And then they run society square on into the paradox of thrift. That while that is rational for you who just lost your job at the factory, if we mimic that behavior at the village level, we will have a depression. So I'm not saying that politicians are irrational in appealing in the fashion I just articulated to potential voters. They're not, because it works to get reelected. If there's any question about that, just look at Europe right now. You get reelected for preaching this nonsense. Therefore, it's not nonsense from your individual perspective to preach it, because it leads to your individual optimization outcome. It's not good for society. We, as practitioners of first principles of our field, as an economist, have a duty to teach. Not just complain, but a duty to teach. My friend Paul Krugman practices that duty daily, and sometimes he gets criticized by the field of wonks for trafficking in the politics of policy. Doesn't get any criticism from me. If you don't traffic in the politics of implementation, then you're not relevant. And relevancy is the ultimate practical goal, at least for me, of what I do. When I was a fund manager, the practicality was to take a small pile of money and make it a very large pile of money. Now that I'm retired, I have a different metric of optimization. I want ideas, little ideas, become a big pile of better outcomes for the village in which I live. So I'll conclude on first principles number one. Everyone got that one down? Micro is not macro. Macro is not a summing up of micro. The paradox of aggregation is not just a lofty concept that you have to learn to pass Dimitri's exam and forget. You have to remember it and practice it forever. How's that for a pitch for your class? He's nodding over here. I'm preaching to the converted. That is first principle number one. First principle number two. Unlike the case with principle number one of micro and macro, monetary and fiscal policy are not inherently different instruments. I thought long and hard before I said that, Jan. Because I am not a high church MMTer, and I just articulated a high church MMT thesis. Monetary and fiscal policy are not inherently different instruments. Big contrast to my first principle when I said micro and macro are inherently different disciplines. Monetary and fiscal policies are not inherently different instruments. That does not mean that we should not, from time to time, structure them living on different streets. How far those streets should be apart, and whether or not there should be occasional block parties is, in many respects, an empirical question. But inherently, monetary and fiscal policy are not different instruments. Both monetary and fiscal policy are macro instruments. Remember principle number one. Moving to principle number two, monetary and fiscal policy are not inherently different instruments because they are instruments in the macro toolkit. Not the micro toolkit, but the macro toolkit. Doesn't mean that monetary and fiscal policy don't have microeconomic outcomes. Art Laffer notwithstanding, supply-side economics, which is a microeconomic discipline, is not total bunk. But supply-side economics and micro incentives associated with supply-side economics is not macro. Macro is about fundamentally in practical terms. Remember the bumper sticker? Practicalities. And practical terms is about aggregate demand. Supply-side economics is not a macro concept whatsoever. Supply-side economics is a micro concept. It's about micro incentives, but it is not a macro discipline whatsoever. Macro is all about the demand side of the economy, not the supply side of the economy. I would like to believe, but I can't, but I would like to believe that the doctrine of supply-side economics as macro died with Say's law. But the fact that I still actually say Say's law in polite society says that my wish has not been fulfilled. There still is a great muddle in our field of the notion that supply will create its own demand in the long run. Just wrong. In the long run, we're dead. For any practical horizon, demand drives supply. And demand comes about in part on the basis of how governments, which are the architecture of the village, carry out fiscal and monetary policy.